Hey, I'm Dukes on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and greensunzenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store where you can buy singles through TCG Player or Card Hoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it. Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with something a little bit different. This is just a deck tech of what I'm currently playing in Legacy. This is Abzan Maverick with a pretty big change. That is main deck Thoughtseize. Recently, Mime's Desire has been unprinted or unbanned for the Legacy format, and online there's been a lot of combo coming out of the woodwork, and leagues have been pretty filled with it. Thoughtseize is a way to have some more game, especially in game 1 against combo, but is also there to make sure that we can find a path to win for the other decks. I think Thoughtseize is really nice in a Green Suns deck because you're able to know if you should be accelerating, if you should be moving towards something like a Gaddock Teeg or a Collector Ouphe as fast as possible, if Knight or Grist or potentially Endurance is going to be your best 3-drop, and how you should be getting there. If you should be wastelanding your opponent, or if you should be wastelanding a specific color. Should you be keeping the wasteland for yourself? Is this going to be a matchup where that mana actually is more important for you? And of course, can also take your opponent off some pretty key cards. Could potentially take them off the Ponder for the Island Ponder Keep people out there. And also, I think it just generally works pretty well in a deck that is looking to attack your opponent in many different ways. And the stack, other than Swords to Plowshares, isn't typically one where Maverick does have some sort of fighter, I guess. But this, otherwise, is a pretty stock-ish list for what we're seeing online. We are playing the full set of Orcish Bowmasters. I think this card is just great. It allows us to really punish the Brainstorm decks and other decks looking to draw cards. It does create extra bodies, which is great for Grist, great for Fiend Artisan, and also really good for Gaea's Cradle. And it can potentially also pressure Planeswalkers like Nissa and Teferi in a way that makes your opponent actually deal with either Bowmaster or the token with actual cards, which is great from a virtual card advantage point. And I think it just fits really well in that 2-mana slot for Maverick. Obviously, we've always had great 3-drops in things like Knight, and as they've been printed, Ramunap, Endurance, Grist, and then 1-drops, of course, with Acceleration, sometimes Mother of Runes. But I think the 2-drop slot for a long time has just always been a bit of a filler. Things like Outland Liberator, Collector Ouphe, Gaddock Teeg are only good in certain matchups. Fiend Artisan is nice to get, but at the same time, isn't really something you want to be getting early on when you might want to be playing around Bolt, or just want to maybe save the Green Suns for a turn or two before you know what you're up against. I guess in a way, Fiend is a way to get a Green Suns on the table, so you can still do something for your turn, get a threat into play, and then maybe go from there on how you want to attack a certain metagame. Because this version has the full playset of Orcs and also these Swords to Plowshares, I do have these Sylvan Libraries in the main deck. 2 of these, I was playing around with 1, didn't really see it enough, and I do really like 2 from just a consistency perspective. I think with the Thoughtseizers as well, it paves the way for Sylvan Library to come down and most likely allow you to untap and draw some cards off it. So taking out something like a Prismatic Ending or a Narset. I think I said Nissa before as well. I meant Narset. Or a opposing Orcish Bowmaster would be fantastic. So I think the libraries are great. We are playing the 2 Noble split, 2 Ignobled and 2 Noble Hierarch. Black mana in this version of the list is pretty high. Wanting 2 Orcish Bowmaster and potentially Thoughtseize on turn 2 as a 2-spell turn is probably going to come up a lot. So being able to go buy you into Ignobled Hierarch, into land, Thoughtseize, Bowmaster is something that I hope comes up a lot, because Thoughtseizing your opponent in that situation might cause them to brainstorm, which thankfully Bowmaster is pretty good against. This has also been reflected in the mana base, where I've gone for a Nurturing Peatland over Horizon Canopy. It's still a green source, so I can green suns off it and cast my early mana dorks, and then it also is just another black source, which is great. And if it gets to a stage where I want to cycle it, I can, which is cool. Wasteland, I think, is really good right now, especially with the new deck coming online, which is the Cascade deck, Mississippi River. I forget the actual name of the commander card that is now online, but Wasteland's very good against that deck because a lot of their lands come in tapped, but tap for 2. So you want to be able to get rid of those before they get to untap and use that mana. So having access to the Wastelands is really nice. And I think talking about the mana base is a good move back to Ramunap, which is a card that has seen not as much play as it used to. Not only in Maverick, but also in a lot of depth decks. Players moving away from Ramunap and just making use of the spot with, I guess, more meta-specific cards for the format they're playing, or the meta that they're playing. I think Ramunap is really strong still. I really like it as kind of the 4th Knight of the Reliquary. It's kind of Knight with haste in a lot of situations where you just want to get... It's where you want to Green Suns for something like a Wasteland. Because you're able to Green Suns and play the Wasteland straight away. You don't have to wait for the Ramunap to untap. So I think that's really strong. I really like, of course, being able to get back Dryad Arbor each turn. You could potentially get back Peatland every turn and draw an additional card. But I do like Ramunap even as a 2/3 body against things like the 2/2 token from Fable. It is also quite good against a lot of the orcs. Doesn't die to it. Could potentially, if they play a Bowmaster, ping the Ramunap and then double block. That does deal with it, but I've always been a big fan of Ramunap turning on the graveyard as a resource, which I think is really powerful. The more areas of the battlefield that you can turn on, or more areas of what you're playing with, I guess, I think the better. And Ramunap just allowing you to even recover from some sort of Wasteland start is really good. I recently had a stream with Newton, and a lot of what he talks about and how he's kind of built elves and the Fiend Artisan package, and which hate bears make it into that Fiend Artisan package, I think makes me realize what are the kind of I win buttons in Maverick. And it's not as easy as it used to be. A lot of decks early on used to fold to turn 2 Gaddock Teeg, turn 2 Thalia off a Matador with a Wasteland. These used to be what I call stop signs, and now they're kind of just speed bumps. So they are annoying, but most decks these days can get over those, even in game 1 where they might be highly relevant. So making sure that you do have I win buttons is good. And I think, in my opinion, or at least from the evidence in the leagues that I've had with Ramunap, is that a Ramunap on the field with a Wasteland in the bin against a lot of these greedy decks is just a concession. I've been getting a lot of concessions off Ramunap, which is really nice. And I literally mean Ramunap hitting the field and not even able to click the Wasteland in the bin. The opponent will just say, okay, well, I can't beat that. I was playing that in a Mother deck. I didn't always have Mum on the field, but obviously having Mum to protect some of these I win buttons is very good. But I did move Mum out of this deck, mainly because we also have Thoughtseize to clear the way, and we have so many copies of the key cards in things like Bowmaster and Thalia and Knight that I didn't really feel like I needed to protect one creature. Even decks like Ant or Tess or some of these combo decks playing Mind's Desire, Teeg by itself or alongside Thalia should be enough, coupled with Thoughtseize. But there is a world where you could play something like Sylvan's Safekeeper if you didn't want to take up all the spots of Mother of Runes, usually as a 2 to 3 of, if not a 4 of, but most lists I see kind of just like round out the deck with 2 or 3 copies. Safekeeper is just nice as a Green Suns target. You could have in the board a little bit like you do in Depths, with kind of the protect the Queen or King strategy against these decks where, say, High Tide might have bounce in blue spells or dress down, which actually gets around everything. But yeah, I think that Mum is good. Not as great with Bowmaster in the field, but I do think this deck just has so many good 1-drops that you're always going to run into the situation where Bowmaster is going to take out one of your 1-drops. At least, you know, on the play, potentially Mum could untap and save you down the line from a Bowmaster or 2. A little bit of rambling, but I don't mind that. I have the deck set out here, as you can see, in the mana base, the acceleration and Sylvan Library, the Green Sun's targets, the removal package, and then sort of the combo part. So sort of winning the game and then not losing the game is here. And then obviously making sure we can cast our spells and get to the stage where we can hopefully accelerate on turn 1. Because I think even in 2023, being able to accelerate your mana on turn 1 is still a pretty, not unfair thing to do, but not something that every single deck has the ability to do. So I think that being able to hit your mana dorks is really strong. And I've found a pretty good sweet spot with the 4 mana dorks and the Dryad Arbor alongside the 4 Green Sun Zeniths. When it comes to sideboarding, I think with mapping, I can probably still work on this list a bit, but I typically go, we have 15 cards. Let's break it up into sort of 5 different strategies. So here we have 3 for artifacts and enchantments, 3 for blue, 3 for creature decks, and then the other 3 and 3 as 6 for combo. Combo in both permanents, so creature-based permanents in Canonist and Opposition Agent, and then permanents in non-creature, which is Deafening Silence, and then stack-based interaction, which is Surgical. Because I think it's pretty important these days to mix up your hate, because say if you have all creature hate and your opponent plays Dress Down, that's probably it. If you have only Deafening Silences and your opponent plays Echoing Truth, that's probably it. And then also something like Surgical and Endurance, against maybe like Cephalid Breakfast if you want to go after the combo. Having a way to play around something like a Cabal Therapy, naming just Endurance. If you play 4 Endurance, obviously not that great, but by changing it up, you do get sort of around those. I think it's also very, really important to have some free spells for when you're on the draw against combo. So things like Force of Vigor, Surgical Extraction, Mindbreak Trap could definitely be worth considering with all the combo online right now. But I think for a deck like Maverick that probably needs to get to turn 2 or 3 to get a creature down that's actually going to have an effect on the game, you really need to buy your time for those turns. So the turn 0, 1, 2, you want to be able to have some sort of free interaction in your hand. And yeah, kind of live till you get the stage to untap and hopefully cast a Thalia or an Ouphe or a Teeg or Bowmasters. Thoughtseize I've actually kind of liked in the control decks as well, and even decks like Death and Taxes, I don't mind it. Any sort of Stoneblade deck where a lot of their creatures are getting 2-for-1 advantages, being able to take that away from your opponent is quite strong. It's obviously a pseudo way to deal with Kaldra after your opponent has Stoneforged for it. Being able to take out, say, a Recruiter of the Guard before they get, say, Violent 3 or some other value off it. I definitely don't mind Thoughtseize. And I don't mind Thoughtseize coupled with Surgical against some namesake combo decks that Maverick doesn't have a great time against. The big ones being Doomsday and also Show and Tell. Not the greatest strategies, but that is sometimes how I win. So going after, obviously, Doomsday or Show and Tell or Sneak Attack can be really strong. And then, yeah, Surgical's always an interesting one against Doomsday. It's not a graveyard deck per se, but even going after something like Underground Sea has gotten some wins, which is pretty interesting after they've done their pile. It also obviously makes them shuffle, so it does change the pile. But Surgical mainly there for Reanimator and lands, which we do actually see in a fair amount of the Legacy metagame. So this is currently the top 10 decks based off the last 30 days of MTG Goldfish's online sort of metagame presence. And I think this is pretty much what I would expect to play against in leagues. Definitely Grixis Delver. Death Shadow's been around. I haven't played against Painter in a while. Reanimator is typically in, probably every 1.5 leagues that I play. Some sort of Depths deck is also there, if not Maverick itself, which is always cool to see. There has been an uptick, I feel, in Mono Red Prison, and I think that's because a lot of decks are moving towards these 3 or 4, if not 5 color decks, which is pretty greedy, but obviously Mono Red is there to, stop that greed, and it's been performing really well. Lands, Typically a pretty solid matchup for Maverick. I always really enjoy the matchup. Death and Taxes, I find a pretty hard one, just because of how the deck's progressed with getting value creatures in the deck. There's so many 2-for-1s that it's really hard to keep up with, and even cards like Solitude make it really hard for combat math, knowing when to attack, things like that. Doomsday, always pretty tough to play against, but we do see it online. And 8-cast, I haven't played against that much either. It might be from Orcish Bowmaster, but yeah, just haven't really run into much 8-cast. The thing to note as well is that I find when I stream in the evening in Australia, the metagame is very different to the morning crew in the US. So typically what I play online isn't really what, say, the majority of people in the US play against, which I find pretty interesting. The last thing I wanted to do with this list was go ahead and just do some basic hands. This is the same list that we have, and just go through and see if we would do some keeps, if we would mulligan, what we would mulligan. This hand here is pretty good. It has the ability to fetch for a Savannah turn 1, play a Hierarch, play a turn 2 Knight, or potentially play Wasteland and Gaddock Teeg. The issue with playing a Teeg in the blind is that it does turn off our own Green Suns, which is a little bit tough, but I wouldn't mind it if I saw something like a Underground Sea into a Ponder, but I would see that as a 6 and say the Gaddock Teeg is the 7th card, and if I did mulligan to that, I'd probably keep it, so I'd probably just keep that hand anyway. This one's a little bit different. This is always a tough one because I find the starts with a Mana Dork are very different to the starts without. But what this hand does have is 3 lands, 4 spells, which is always pretty nice. It does have some combo hate in Endurance. It has Wasteland for interaction, which is great. And it also has the Fetch, which is pretty subtle, but it does mean we can play a land on turn 1 around Wasteland and not have to worry about that. It is also a Verdant Catacombs, so it can fetch a forest if we're up against some sort of Blood Moon deck, or a Wasteland comes down opposing us. So I really don't mind this. We have a turn 2 play of Orcish Bowmasters into a Knight or an Endurance if we haven't pitched it. So I think this hand is actually pretty good as well. I think we just clicked to get a new one. No? I did it before. There we go. Okay, first mulligan. This is a pretty easy mulligan because the one thing I want to do is keep a hand that casts my spells, and relying on Dryad Arbor as my only land to cast anything here is pretty tough. If this was a fetch land and we were on the draw, I would probably consider this. A land off the top makes this hand really good, and even if we miss the second land but keep the Ignobled, we do get to cast a Sylvan Library and then hopefully hit all our land drops from there. We have the Endurance again as early combo hate, which is really nice. We do have the Teeg, but we could pitch that to the Endurance if it's not going to be reliable. And obviously already have the Knight and the Swords for removal and a threat. So I could see myself mulliganing this on the play for sure. On the draw, I could still see a mulligan, but I think I would probably keep it just because the upside is quite high. No, I wouldn't. No, only if this was a fetch land. Only if this was a fetch land. Otherwise, pretty easy mulligan. This is a pretty fantastic hand, let's be honest. We have Windswept Heath, pass, into hold up Sword. We could also play the Plains and then Sword. Currently, there's no reason not to play the Plains because we might want to keep the fetch land for Dryad Arbor. The only thought is... No, actually, yeah. I think I would play the Plains into Swords, because we do get to follow up with either, Bayou into Orcish Bowmasters or Bayou into Thalia, or Windswept Heath into either one of these if you want to play around Wasteland. So probably Windswept Heath pass into Bowmaster and then having the Knight. So this is a really nice hand because does it have a game against Delver? Yes. Does it have game against combo? Yes. Does it have game against midrange? Yes. Against control? Yes. I think the only thing this hand loses to is probably fast combo, especially on the draw. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting one because what we have here is 1 mana, but we have multiple ways to accelerate. So I'm not a big fan of one-landers, but I think this hand has so many ways to accelerate if we don't hit a land that I'm pretty happy to keep it. But the only issue here is if we fetch for a Bayou and play the Ignoble Hierarch, we don't have access to black. If we fetch for a Savannah, we do have access to black through the Ignoble Hierarch, just has to survive. We again have the Endurance in case we want to pitch that to a Green Suns against fast combo. And again, is actually pretty solid. I would say Delver is where this hand is a little bit weak. And the only reason I say that is because of the mana and how well Delver can go after us. Because if we go Savannah, Ignoble Hierarch, usually this is met with a Bolt. And then if we miss a land and go Dryad Arbor pass, then I could definitely see a Wasteland coming or another Bolt, which would put you really behind. So a lot of things to think about, but I think all in all, this hand is on the side of a trap, but I would keep it. Another unplayable hand. It does have 2 lands, but neither of these can play Noble Hierarch. Neither of these can cast the Fiend Artisan. And I think that this hand is just, yeah, it has lands, but it can't cast the spells that we want to cast. So this is a pretty good hand, honestly. If it was up against a fair deck like Delver or another green-white X deck, I'd be happy to keep it. Up against Elves, I'd be happy to keep it as well. One thing that's a little bit interesting is that I guess the Bowmaster actually gives us 2 creatures for Grist to tick down straight away. I was thinking of potentially using one of these fetch lands to get Dryad Arbor in an end step to then untap and cast a Grist to sack the Dryad Arbor. But what that means is the other fetch could only get either green and white or green and black. So that would kind of put you in a situation where you might be it might be a little bit awkward to be able to cast the Swords and the Bowmaster. But yeah, I think this is a pretty great hand. One thing I like doing against a deck that looks like it's going to try to play around Wasteland is probably lead on the Verdant and the Windswept, and not play Wasteland until you see a dual land. I think that's usually pretty key. This hand is okay. It is a 2-lander with no acceleration, but we do have Windswept pass into turn 2 Thalia or Orcish Bowmaster. If we draw a land, we could potentially Fiend Artisan if we really wanted to, but if we hit 3 lands and get Ramunap down, we have the Windswept Heath to get back for our 4th, 5th, or 6th land. So this could also lead to a Wasteland lock with the Ramunap, which is nice. And I think the Thalia and Orcish Bowmaster is a nice, cheap interaction against a lot of decks that this is probably good enough to keep. We'll do one more. The last one I would keep, I believe it was Wasteland, Savannah, Double Sword, Gaddock Teeg, Noble, and Knight. A pretty great hand because it has something for combo, something for the fair decks. It has a good plan as well. Yeah, not much else to say. This hand as well, pretty great. We have acceleration in Ignoble Hierarch. We have all our colors online if the Ignoble Hierarch survives, because we could get a Savannah. The tricky thing is, a lot of the time your first creature is gonna die. So if we do fetch Savannah and play Ignoble Hierarch, we then don't have access to black mana unless we then Green Suns for another Ignoble Hierarch or draw a land the following turn after Ignoble Hierarch dies. So you do have to think a little bit about what you want to do here, because if you fetch a Savannah, you can play a Gaddock Teeg turn 2, but that turns off your Green Suns. So if you're going for Savannah, you're probably going for Green Suns turn 2 to build out your mana again, or potentially get another 2-drop in something like Fiend Artisan, which on this board is pretty good, especially with the Orcish Bowmaster giving you another token to get rid of it. The Wasteland is obviously a kind of spell land, so yeah, I think this is a pretty good keep. Honestly, it's nice to see that the consistency of the deck so far has been pretty good. There hasn't really been too many mulligans. This is probably close to it. We do have access to pretty much casting anything we draw into, but I kind of feel like one more land or one more mana dork off the top just gives us too much fluff. In saying that, I think if I knew my opponent was on Delver and this was on the play, I'd be pretty happy to play this out and probably go aggressively for dual lands, because I would kind of want my opponent spending time going after my mana, not knowing that we actually have all the mana we need, and taking the time to Wasteland us and Bolt us instead of playing threats. the swords here, I would play around Daze at all costs, just because it's currently our only removal spell. But otherwise, yeah, it's a tough one. It's not great against fast combo. Against control, it is nice to hit your mana, but this can be a little bit rough if you don't draw something like a Sylvan Library early on, or a real piece of interaction to fight them. But hey, that's going to be sort of my talk about Abzan Depths. Really cool to see in the Abzan Discord how many different builds there are, because honestly, you could move the Thoughtseizers to the board as sort of, part of this 6, and then that shores up, maybe you want to play Once Upon a Time, maybe you want to play Mother of Runes, maybe you want to play not so many copies of Orcish Bowmaster and play something like a Outland Liberator in the main deck, and have an out there. Just to reference why I'm not playing Outland Liberator or Knight of Autumn in the main deck, is that based on the games that I've played so far online, I believe it's 43% of the matches I'm keeping it in, and 57 I'm not. So I decided that in the main deck, I don't need it right now online, and that for when I do want something like that, where I don't want Force of Vigor, it's nice just to have the Liberator there as a Green Sun's target. So one thing I will say is Blue-Red Delver and Grixis Delver have been playing a fair amount of Grafdigger's Cage or Unlicensed Hearse in the sideboard, which can be tough because typically you're siding out things like Outland Liberator or Knight of Autumn if you do have them in the main deck. So not having an out to those is pretty tough, but I think unless you're playing something like Prismatic Ending, it's probably not worth bringing in Artifact or Enchantment Hate to fight against those. It's more a case of if they have Grafdigger's Cage, so be it. If they have Unlicensed Hearse, so be it. There's not too much you can do about it, and it's not worth fighting for while kind of not directing your attention at their actual threats. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this content. Let me know in the comments if you did, and let me know if you are currently playing Maverick, and if you are, what's your tech? What are you playing? What colors? What's your local meta like? I'd love to know. So till then, catch you next time.